when you're going into the hiring process, how do you approach it? How do you find people who have a similar drive to what you're doing and yet be open enough to look at people who maybe aren't like you? How are you assessing whether or not they're successful and whether or not they can continue to grow with an organization?
I often find is sales leaders telling me something lame, like, Dan, they just don't have the it factor. And I was like, no, 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 no. What you're really saying is they don't have the I factor. They're not like you. How you doing, Clay?
I'm doing well, Dan. How are you?
Oh man, it's been fun. This consulting project I'm on is really intellectually stimulating and challenging, but managing a house of 6 kids and being an executive in revenue is not exactly easy. You know that well.
And executive in revenue that's not even in the same state is
not even in the same state. And a database and running that.
No big deal.
No big deal.
No big deal. Well, thank you for your time today. We'll get through as much as we can. I'm glad I'm not the only one that bookends 30-minute meetings foolishly, because I did the same thing on the back end of ours. So we'll get through as much as we can, but I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you and kind of pick your brain on some of these, because I don't think you can be too prepared or over educate yourself on some of these topics. And I think where I want to start, Dan, is really with hiring. I think I'd seen in one of your videos, you mentioned 70% success rate is like world class, if you can hire well 70% of the time. And I, when you're going into the hiring process, how do you approach it? How do you find people who have a similar drive to what you're doing and yet be open enough to look at people who maybe aren't like you?
Yeah. Yes, I think that's really, really good. First, what I want to go into is what to measure. So many people think things matter that don't. Really, really good example. I won't use the name in this case, but one of the top executives in Utah, leading a group a little over 500 people. When they first started in sales, my boss, CEO, was commenting on, like, that individual stutters too much. There is no way they're going to be able to sell big deals. They're not going to have the leadership presence. They don't have what it takes. And my opinion is like, well, I'm looking at the data that kind of confounds what you're saying. I don't think we should decide who goes into leadership based on a stutter. And if they're performing, the people around them get better. The people that they mentor get better. Why not give them an official leadership opportunity? You go 15 years later, that individual is responsible for a massive organization. The stutter is still there, but it doesn't actually matter. And so I've spent my career of 22 years now in sales studying what really does matter. And when you get into the hiring process, I'll give you the worst example possible. And I'm probably speaking too much on this example now, but I had an example the other day where a leader came to me, and this individual that I interviewed scored in the top 5% of any leader that I've interviewed. And so in my mind, slam dunk, you should hire this person. But relative to the organizational culture, this person is the opposite. They are a different gender than was most common in this company. A different age, a different ethnicity, a different height, and a different set of hobbies. And so what I often find is sales leaders telling me something lame, like, Dan, they just don't have the it factor. And I was like, no, 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 no. What you're really saying is they don't have the I factor. They're not like you. And so I've invested my career in building a rubric that doesn't look for people like me. It allows for genius across 5 core categories. Applied intellect. So not just are they capable of learning, do they actually apply that learning for raw IQ type of stuff? Emotionally applied intellect. So emotional IQ, but applied. Raw work ethic. Performing in whatever they do go work in. So they don't choose to do 100 things, but they choose a few things and succeed in those, or they choose 100, but they succeed in all of them. I haven't met any people like that. Usually it's they pick a few and they go and excel. And then are there certain characteristics that are unique to a company that you need to go in and review for? And that might just be It's startup land, and they're going to have to work harder because nobody's yet succeeding, and we need somebody to break through. It might be that it's a culturally very, very kind organization, so doubling down on that EQ intelligence. It might be the product is very, very technical, and there's not enough money to have a sales engineering team yet. And so their raw applied IQ needs to be higher. But other than that, I use those 5 characteristics. And then I've devoted the last 15 years of my 22 years in sales to fine tuning what that is. Then you can have anybody succeed. You could be the hardest worker, but slightly lower raw applied IQ, or slightly lowered raw applied EQ, or past performance even, and still get hired. You could just be off the charts IQ, slightly lower in all the others, or off the charts performance, but you do it your own way. And so it's a balanced scorecard that doesn't allow for hippos with wide hips to say this metric matters more than the others. And then I don't pay attention to anything else. Most companies that I work with and any company I run, if they're an entry-level position, this interview is the only interview that determines if they get hired. If it's a more skilled role, then there's one additional interview that they do that assesses this core skills that actually matter in that. Long talk. Sorry for talking so much, but that's it.
I love that. And you brought up about 15 questions, but I'll poke at one thing. So if you're a second line manager and you're looking to promote somebody who might be a little bit outside the bubble, as you mentioned, you're directly kind of going against the instincts of maybe your boss or your CEO or somebody that's there. When you're making that decision to promote somebody or to give them that opportunity, are you bringing others with you to help do that? How do you make that final decision? How do you give that person the green light and get other people on board to support that individual?
Yeah, it's a really good question. What I do there is there are 13 measures, and we don't have enough time to go into those, that I assess leaders from within a company on, that then would hit all of the check boxes of HR, finance, marketing, the CEO, and the CPO for product. And so those are categorized into, do they exemplify work ethic themselves and those that they're responsible for? Do they exemplify a great way of thinking about people between employee engagement, attrition, and how they recruit? Do they achieve the end result as measured by quota? Do they collaborate well? There's literally 13 of these measures. So then what I do is I spend all of my time not aligning on should this person get a shot, but on the system that assesses if they should get a shot. Then that individual that may not be liked by executive A, it doesn't matter because executive A agreed to the system. They don't have to be buddies with that person. They can stutter, which may not be your style of speaking. They can be of a different background than you, and that's okay. I worked with some companies that obsess on you couldn't be hired in their organization unless you came from a top 5 MBA program. And I went and showed them, I was like, well, what if they hit all of these things and they aren't that? Well, that's not going to happen. Well, let's test it out. We did an experiment. We went and hired a bunch of people, and they were just as likely to perform outside of that criteria as they were within, and then they were open-minded. So I try to use data to remove essentially remove the human decision out of the equation, and instead build a process that makes it easy to say, look, we agreed on this. They deserve a shot.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I spent a good chunk of the early part of my career trying to find people exactly like me. And it took me a long time to fail to realize that that's not the best way, that everybody does have their own genius. You talked a little bit about culture fit, and I want to talk about that for just a moment. Culture's thrown around a lot. How do you define culture? And then how do you build the kind of culture that's going to lead to a successful organization?
Yeah, so the process I'll describe here is unique for each size of company. So the amount of layers depend on how many layers there are within the org. So I'll take a normal Series B company here in this case. So there should be a culture that the CEO prescribes to. And there's usually an acronym of some kind that's part of it. And the people that report into the CEO should embody that. If they don't, the CEO needs to fix it. Then the people that report into those people should embody that. They don't have to be perfect at it. Nobody does. But they should stand behind those principles. Once as a CEO, you've established that those core values are met, you have to allow for the freedom. So we'll go CEO to now, let's say, a director of sales, that there's something unique and special about working for Clay within that organization that's celebrated, in addition to what the CEO drives. I don't know what that is, though. Like when I was, it's different for every leader, and there's no wrong answer other than one that demeans other people. And so like in one organization that I led, there was I called my organization Team Olympus. We were the Greek gods, but if you notice, the Greek gods all had different superpowers. Each Greek god or each leader got to pick which Greek god they were. And they were allowed to go build their own special cultures. But on Team Olympus, we had an agreement. We will not miss a single quota. Now, how are we going to go make that true? We ended up missing one quota by 1.5%. But because we lived by that rule of we won't miss, we were really good at forecasting, diagnosing forecasts, and how to go turn it around. Right now, I'm helping a company right now where the number one thing is trust and collaboration that we've got to get fixed. There's too many silos, too many groups that don't trust each other. So once a day, I'm asking them, who did you call on your phone just to have a chat with today? Like, hey, what are you talking about? I had to get this done. No. You're not going to get those things done unless all these other groups trust you. You spend no personal time with them, so they don't trust you. It looks like you operate in a silo because you do. And so right now, people would think that was my number one obsession. Other companies, they already do that well enough, and it fits well within the org. But what I recommend is you have a CEO-driven culture and force that CEO to come up with what does that mean. Have an executive team that supports that unanimously drives that culture, and then allow each of them to build their own unique cultures. Then whoever reports into them, so the director of sales has the unique things of being part of that org. Then their managers, what's special about being for each manager? And that a director should be asking those managers, what do you want to be special and unique about being on your team within this company? And it could be doubling down on something that's already part of the culture in sales, but it's uniquely doubled down on within theirs. It could be something the CEO drives. It could be something entirely unique. That's how I define culture. Then what you do is when you have an aligned, purpose-built culture, then you go in and measure employee engagement. Are the employees engaged? Attrition, so engaged that they want to be part of this, except for a reasonable amount of attrition that just happens because of life. And do the leaders bring in people that are going to further enhance that culture?
I love it. So let me ask a question. I know you were part of an organization where you were an early employee. And forgive me, you'll have to correct me on the data. It's been a few months, but when you took over a leadership role in that organization, who had missed quota month over month over month, and then you took over that opportunity, and then you proceeded to hit quota 34 out of the next 35 months, or whatever that number is. You made some adjustments right off the bat. And I don't know what those were. I want to explore those adjustments, and maybe it was cultural, maybe it was a thought, maybe it was the way the expectations of the team. I'm not sure, but to get into an organization and be able to make a shift like that, where Team Olympus, we're not going to miss quota. There's so many outside factors that play into that. How do you approach that process where you say, okay, this is how we're not going to miss quota? Does that make sense?
Yep. So there's a lot of those examples. So I actually don't know which one we were talking about when we were talking before. So I'll take one where it fits the best, kind of what that story was. There was an example. I actually needed to go, and it was a European organization. And there was one of 40 reps hitting quota. That one individual was an expat moving back to the United States relatively quickly. Pretty toxic, unhappy employee engagement scores. And what I went in and just assessed real quickly was, how is it possible that there's only 2 people leaders leading this whole organization, and one of them is the MD responsible for a whole set of other people, not just sales? So the first thing I said, we've got a problem with leadership. If there's not enough leaders to go and deploy, the ideal culture you want to go build, you need to go fix that problem first, because leaders are the initial professors, teachers, inspirers of the culture that will then bring in others that embody the culture that we're trying to build. So the first step was going in and building a leadership team. Then the second was establishing a culture of performance, helping each individual understand if you're not yet succeeding, that's okay. We'll work with you, but you need to be doing the hard work metrics. If you're not willing to do the hard work metrics and you're not succeeding, how can we humanely help you go find another wonderful opportunity somewhere else? Because I can't work with somebody that doesn't want to do the work and is not succeeding. Some people are really talented at their job. They don't have to do that much work and they still thrive. Amazing for them. I've never been that human being, but there are plenty of those. But if they're neither succeeding nor working hard, help them go find an awesome opportunity somewhere else for them. And then everybody else develop. And so in that particular situation, we had daily training. Every single day, we went, and there was a 12-week course that I personally built because there was no training and enablement. And it started at 7 in the morning. Whoever wanted to come could come. And so, but it was going to be only if you want to. From that, I got a whole bunch of people that could train on their own because I didn't have normal business hours to go in and train. Then I got those people, the evangelists of it, to go do a noon brown bag training. I continued to personally train those in the early morning that wanted to come early. Then they would go teach at noon anybody else that wanted to go in and join. And then so with leadership, helping those that didn't want to be there go somewhere else, and development, we were able to turn it around.
Well, that's terrific. And I want to ask about that in our last few minutes here. When you're talking about putting in the work and measuring the inputs as a manager, as a leader of an organization, or even as a leader of a smaller group, how do you go about determining what the right inputs are to get the outputs that you want?
Yeah. So are we sticking to sales or in any org? Do you want it specific to sales or any org?
Let's talk about sales.
Okay. So in sales, it may sound oversimplified for me, but if you have enough pipeline, then you'll bill enough, assuming you're skilled. And so then I just go look at his inputs around, or so like leading indicators on hard work all revolve around pipeline. Depending on how skilled your team is how far down the work funnel you need to go. If it is, let's call it a bunch of people straight out of school, they're going to feel bad if you give them how much pipeline did you generate as their target, because in the beginning, they're mostly going to miss that. You're having to teach them every step of the way. So I start off with, how many new contacts did you reach out to this week? How many calls, emails, and social touches combined as one prospecting effort? So one prospecting effort includes all three. Did you do this week, this month? How many conversations did you have? Then once they move past that, less of those metrics, more of how many first meetings did you schedule? Then eventually, how much pipeline did you add? Then eventually, how active or what percent of the ideal pipeline, so let's say it's a 3.3x times quota pipeline, are you actively working? Meaning you've had a live meeting in the last 5 weeks minimum. Mm-hmm. And so you give more autonomy and flexibility as their skills improve. So those work ethic metrics evolve over time and evolve over the role. And that's kind of how I look at it.
That's terrific. That's terrific. And so if you take that into the leadership side of things, and you mentioned, at what point do you feel like you can either fix a leader or you need to move on for a leader? Right? Like for sometimes an individual sales rep, the quota, the pipe, I mean, some of those things are pretty measurable. For a leader, how are you assessing whether or not they're successful and whether or not they can continue to grow with an organization?
Yeah, it's the same thing. So I look at the work ethic metrics. Usually what I do for leaders is I take the sum of the target for their work ethic metrics, times it by 0.8. So they get a 20% reduction to allow for attrition, to allow for some unforeseen consequences. If they can't get their team to go in and work and their employee engagement is low, then I'll usually go do a stop, start, and continue with their team to go figure out what are the things you all love happening, what are the things and you want to continue, What are the things not yet happening you'd love to see start? What do you want to stop? Then I'm going in and I'm assessing, okay, if they're like, my leader, Dan, belittles me all the time. Give me an example. And if they say, yeah, he held me accountable to hitting my work ethic metric, wrong answer. If it's, they belittled my religion, my race, my way of being, who I am as a human. Okay, you've got a very serious problem. And I would go and I would actually get HR in the room and I'd say, I'm going to give you this feedback. It's brutal, but you need to hear it. If it's sexual harassment, no warning, they're fired. If it is blatant misogyny or sexism or racism, fired. If it is implied and it can't be exactly pinned down, they get a warning. And this better not happen again. I care deeply that every human being that wants to be here, that you've continued to employ, has the opportunity to thrive. The way that you're speaking is unacceptable. I think it's disgusting. They didn't call it disgusting. I'm calling it disgusting. And so then I go in and come up with a plan. Many leaders, I've put on what I call a coaching plan. Coaching plan is, we've already worked together quite a bit. So it's beyond the, hey, we got to go hit these metrics. Let me coach you a little bit. It's moved into, this is not meeting the outcome. This is not meeting the inputs. This impact isn't being had. Very prescriptive. Your employee engagement, percent of reps hitting quota, skills across the team measured across the funnel, collaboration scores when they're getting rated by their peers, all of attrition rates, any of those. It needs to be here. Do you agree? Yes. Here's how I think I can help you. Or how do you think I could help you? How can you help you? Document all of that. 75% of leaders, when it gets that clear, succeed. Most directors don't get that clear with their managers. They just expect they'll figure it out because they figured it out on their own. Mm-hmm. Most VPs don't get that direct with directors. I've got a director I'm working with right now, and I'm telling you, like, whether it's just because I won't come up with the why, but this individual is thanking me and engaged at a level that no one else in the company had ever seen. I'm now getting like, Dan, this person's fired up. Combine that with every time I've given them an intense feedback session saying, Dan, thank you. I'll get better at this, because they know I believe they will. Yeah. It's not to the point of, I don't think you got a prayer. You're going to burn here. But I'm going to tell you because I have to, because I can't fire you until I tell you. They know that I believe that that with coaching, self-coached and me coaching, that they're going to get there.
Yeah. Well, let me ask one more question and kind of follow up to that. And you hear the cliches of, are they willing to run through a wall for you? Whatever you want to use. It sounds like you're able to build that kind of trust with them where they know that you're more invested in their success than they are, or at least equal to it. What advice would you give for managers and leaders that are trying to forge that kind of a relationship with their team where they can hold them both accountable, but also they welcome that kind of feedback because they know you've got their best interests at heart? How are you building that trust and that bridge?
Time and evidence. So over your career, there'll be enough examples that damn you because you didn't treat people that way, or that buoy you up. And so when I go into a new organization and I'm asking really hard things, it is not uncommon that I'll ask them to go on LinkedIn, find anybody that worked directly for me, call them. I don't even care who it is. Ask them if I'm a mad scientist, or I'm crazy, or I'm unfair, or if I'm going to go in and actually help you get there. And if they're like, that's too much work, just give me a couple names, I'll do the same thing. I'll just give them a couple names and then go talk to them. So some of it you're going to need to go study and get better at yourself. Some of it is just going to take time, and evidence will come out. You'll go show that over time you actually did care. You wanted to see them succeed. And then as such, they did succeed, and then that trust builds.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Well, Dan, thank you so much for taking some time out. It is great. I really appreciate it. There's a million other questions that we could dive into, but we'll have to do that another time. But thank you.
Yeah, pleasure's mine. Thanks for doing it, and we'll talk soon.